staff, generals, distinguished guests. Thank you to IDSA for the invitation to speak here. It's a great honour. Thank you. My actual paper doesn't really fit into this panel, but I'm going to squeeze it in anyway into the general element of strategy. What I'm going to talk about is the evolution of strategy in Afghanistan, mostly through looking at the British Army and the US Army operations in Afghanistan. Afghanistan then, the basic geography of the place, you see kind of mountainous east and north, and a more flatter desert topography in the south. And it's the south of Afghanistan which I really want to talk about today. Helmand province, especially the province in the middle of the south down there, more clearly labelled there, Helmand province, where the British Army operations and now US Army operations are being undertaken on a quite significant scale. So at the beginning then, we had 2001 Operation Enduring Freedom, and the basic aims to get rid of Al-Qaeda training camps and to take out basically the Taliban government in Kabul in Afghanistan. And those aims are fairly quickly met for the most part in terms of destroying the camps and removing the government. No real problem there. However, in this operation strategy as such should be dictated by the government of Hamid Karzai in Kabul. And this has caused problems in terms of, obviously, various elements from Western forces in Afghanistan and the government themselves in Kabul will have different ideas as to the best strategy to kind of stabilize the country and to get rid of the Taliban insurgents. So there's the first problem. ISAF was established with a basic aim. Again, the aim of ISAF was set up in 2001 by the Americans, was to basically do what the Afghan government wanted it to do, on paper. However, we see many tensions between what the Afghan government itself wants in Afghanistan and what Western forces, particularly US forces who command basically the operation there, want to see happen in the country. The main basis of ISAF operations in support of the Kabul government are these provincial reconstruction teams. Basically, all the provinces of Afghanistan have PRTs in them, which are basically Western forces and some other forces from the West, mostly NATO forces, who are engaged in these kind of operations to kind of rebuild, reconstruct, and bring some sort of measure of stability, of normality or normalcy to Afghanistan itself, and particularly in the more kind of troubled provinces of the south. There are now 15 NATO countries running 25 PRTs all across the country itself. Now these PRTs vary greatly in their ability to do certain things and the money they spend. American-run PRTs are kind of really quite liberal in their use of money, the way they disperse funds, and are really quite the provinces that American forces operate in are really quite well off. And you do see Afghan governors in certain provinces wanting American PRTs in their provinces because they spend far more than, say, the Lithuanian PRT, which hardly spends any money at all in the provinces it runs. So you get a kind of PRT envy in various Afghan provinces. We want as much money as the Americans have. ISAF, now there's the kind of various ISAF operational zones. ISAF started operating around Kabul in the north, and gradually since 2003 these PRTs have spread in a kind of westerly direction into the south and then into the east. You see most of the American forces operate in the east of the country, and you see various other countries, Germany, especially strong in the north, running their PRTs, and other countries down south, notably the British in Helmand province and the Canadians in Kandahar province, running into quite significant opposition from the Taliban in terms of trying to operate their PRTs under pressure of an insurgency going on at the same time. American forces mostly in the east are engaged still in OEF operations, chasing Al-Qaeda terrorists and sometimes operating over the border into Pakistan. Taliban insurgency kind of begins in earnest in 2003, and really quite a surprise. Now, because this insurgency is going on and you have these different countries, so many different countries involved in these PRTs, there is a kind of tension in the best way deemed possible to deal with the insurgency. Germany will have one approach, France will have another approach, British have another approach, Americans, and there's no consistency in approach, in essence, in strategy and tactics to deal with the problem. Even though you have NATO there as a coordinated kind of, in essence, body, as an organisation, the different individual elements within NATO do not have a coordinated approach to fighting insurgency and how to kind of bring stability to their particular provinces. The Germans, for instance, will not engage in any offensive action, not because the German army doesn't want to, but because back home in Germany, the German public will not accept any casualties of their forces. If the German army starts taking casualties, then the German army will be forced to pull out of Afghanistan because public opinion in Germany will not stand for it. And you get the British and the Canadians and the Americans who are far more engaged in taking offensive operations against the Taliban. Other countries will not take offensive operations in terms of counter-insurgency operations against the Taliban. Now, most activity is in the south and the east of the country. And the basic strategy of countries heavily involved in the insurgency, British, Canadians, and the US, is basically to hold the ground, basically, against the Taliban until the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police are of sufficient strength and professionalism to actually take over the job of dealing with the Taliban themselves. Now, there is a problem here in terms of how many troops, Afghan troops, how much Afghan police, how large should they be to deal with the Taliban. Now, there's the money that would have to be spent on building a massive Afghan army to deal with the Taliban would eventually suck up most of the Afghan GDP. So there needs to be a kind of a rethink, I think, in terms of strategy, in terms of how big the Afghan National Army should be to deal with the Taliban insurgency. There is a problem there. How can a small country with a small GDP have a massive army to deal with an insurgency problem? Originally, USCOIN Strategy was kind of Rumsfeldian approach to dealing with the situation in terms of having small groups of forces who could bring in large amounts of firepower, be it artillery or more significantly air power, to deal with once the Taliban elements groups had been found by small groups of special forces, air power would be brought in to deal with those particular groups of Taliban. There were some static American locations, obviously, bases around the country, but not so many. Now, for the Americans, there's a lot of money involved. Obviously, the United States being more generous and more able to provide huge amounts of aid to the PRTs and to bring a great significant improvements in the areas it operated in. So American basic strategies was based significantly on search and destroy, but bringing in lots of aid to make a difference to the everyday lives of the Afghan people. Now, BritishCOIN Strategy, I want to mention it, basically Helmand province down there in the south, along the green stretch of the Helmand River you see in the middle of the south of the country. Helmand province is mostly desert, except along the Helmand River where you do get a lot of agricultural activity. The towns are there, and also the Opium Poppy fields are in that green strip. And that green strip is where the British Army mostly is. Now, in line with what the Afghan government wanted the British Army to do, the British Army went along with what Karzai wanted to see happen in Helmand province. Therefore, these platoon houses were employed by the British Army really against the better sense of British tacticians in terms of this idea of, well, hang on, we're in this kind of situation whereby the idea is we hold these towns, have small bases in these towns, and the kind of oil spot method of stretching out, moving outwards gradually from these original locations to spread stability beyond the towns they are occupying. However, the Taliban turned out to be a lot stronger than the British Army imagined, and these small bases, which were supposed to spread stability outwards, ended up being defended virtually every night from Taliban attacks. Sometimes they were almost overwhelmed by the Taliban, and they were very difficult to resupply. Trying to get helicopters in there was difficult, and road convoys also would be attacked on the way in. Some of these small platoon houses were kind of very close to being lost occasionally in the fights. So the British ended up doing what the Kabul government wanted them to do, basically try to have a presence in these particular places. But as I said, it was holding ground for the sake of holding ground. There was no strategic value in having these small bases in these small towns along the Helmand River Valley. Now, again, a controversial approach taken by the British Army was to negotiate, in essence, with the Taliban. They never said officially that they were talking to the Taliban, but they were talking to the Taliban through village elders in places like Nowzad, Sangin, and Musakala, these small towns in the Helmand Valley. So to reduce pressure on the platoon houses, the British Army did engage in peripheral negotiations with the Taliban themselves. Having conducted negotiations, the British Army then got the village elders in the towns where these platoon houses were to take over the security measures so the British Army could withdraw. Now, in essence, when these tribal elders took over, it was them, in essence, the tribal elders in the towns that were responsible for security and not the British Army anymore. So neither the Taliban nor the British Army were then responsible for security. It was a case of the village elders. However, in many quarters, notably in the American forces and Karzai in Kabul, this was seen as a retreat by NATO forces, a retreat by Afghan authority, the government authority, so it didn't go down too well. So again, we get a lack of coordination across the board between the British, and in this case, the American and the Kabul governments. As and lo and behold, the Taliban then retook the town of Musakala from the village elders almost a year later. So this was a kind of failure on a part of, a few months later, seen as a failure on the part of the British Army. You negotiated to kind of take your troops out, village elders take over, but eventually the Taliban then move in and take over from the village elders. So a town is lost to the Taliban and the British Army looks a bit stupid. One thing also I should point out here is that the British Army tactics were to a large degree dictated by its lack of helicopters. The British Army is not rich in helicopters, and because it has so few in Afghanistan, basically British transport is purely by road, which does dictate you have to be fairly kind of static, you can't move around that much, you can't really take the offensive against the Taliban because you can't dump large bodies of troops in areas where the Taliban might be surprised by them, and therefore you're losing out kind of tactically to the Taliban because you haven't got the ability to move your troops around to basically plonk them in areas where the Taliban might not expect them. So quite static. The British Army then moved away from this platoon houses idea more towards this kind of hearts and minds approach in terms of having kind of light patrolling in various areas and get a touchy-feely to get to know the local people and to bring the message that the British Army is a really good thing. Now, this hearts and minds goes back a long way. Indeed, the first mention of the phrase hearts and minds by the British Army goes back to 1866, when Colonel Robert Sandeman, who was operating in the Punjab at that particular time, kind of basically was the first man to put this kind of phrase in print. So the hearts and minds has always dominated British low-intensity counterinsurgency warfare for a long time. It doesn't go back just to General Templer in Malaya in the 1950s. Again, a bit like the American search and destroy tactics with the British Army, again, you try and find elements of the Taliban and try and bring air power to finish them off, mostly in the British case, Apache helicopters. Targeting Talib leaders, again, a favourite tactic of both the British and American forces, but if you read some of the kind of good books on Afghanistan, the history of Afghanistan, by Afghans themselves, they kind of decry this particular tactic because Afghan kind of fighting units tend to be acephalous. They don't really need a head. They don't really need a leader. Because the Afghan people have been, or the Afghan warriors have been fighting for that long, it's kind of almost kind of instinctive, the ability to fight. They don't particularly need leaders. So in this case, you look at the literature on this particular subject, perhaps targeting Talib leaders is perhaps not the best tactic, but it's debatable. And again, we see differences. We see differences here in the British and American approach. And most significantly, it comes down to the use of firepower. The British tend to be very restrained, and American forces are perceived to be less so. This has caused a huge amount of tension in the British Army, in Helmand province in particular, where, as I said here, a British officer saying, the Americans are at war, we are on operations. And there's a difference in mentality. In the Americans perceived to be fighting a war, whereas the British, for them, it's just another operation, like Northern Ireland, Aden, Oman, going back all through the great stretch of British imperial history, operation after operation after operation. So war, it isn't a war mentality for the British Army, it's operations. And because it's operations, they perceive they must be restrained, they must use discriminatory force and not kill too many local Afghans, because they can't win hearts and minds if they kill too many of the local indigenous population. Change of approach. General Dan McNeill took over from David Richards, a British officer as NATO commander in Afghanistan in February 2007. And this lighter British touch, which kind of dominated places like Helmand province, was kind of, in essence, put to one side by General McNeill, who has now put in more American forces into Helmand province to actually, what he calls, stir things up and get the British to use more force against the Taliban in Helmand province. Because the British were failing in Helmand province. Well, the British accept they were and are failing at the moment in Helmand province. The Taliban have not been defeated. So with more US troops in Helmand province, Musa Qala can be then retaken from the Taliban in December 2007 in a joint US and American and Afghan army operation. Aid, talk about aid. Obviously, if the British are going to fight hard to mines campaign, they need lots of aid to back up their military presence with something saying, here is the British military presence, and it is beneficial for you because of this new school, this new dam, this new kind of operating theatre. They have to bring some sort of benefits. It's not just security benefits, but actual physical benefits to show that the presence, the occupying armies, can actually bring some sort of positives to the situation. However, for the British Army, it is problematic because they rely on something called the comprehensive approach. Security, military security, plus the aid brought in by, in this case, other British aid organisations, by the British government. But the British Army has not been backed up, it feels, by the British government. The British government has been fairly stingy in the aid given to the British Army in Afghanistan. Most of the British government's aid goes direct to Kabul. And because it goes to Kabul, and then has to come down and be distributed by Kabul itself, then it's seen that the Karzai government is corrupt, most of its money disappears somewhere, and very little of it actually comes to Helmand province to help out the British Army. The British Army gets very few funds from the government to actually, for small impact projects on the ground in Afghanistan. Opium Poppy, a huge problem. What to do with it? On the one hand, the poppy production, the money, the profits from it, support the Taliban in the insurgency operation. It pays for recruits, it pays for bribes to local officials from the government. It does a lot of things to drive the insurgency itself. But also it supports the local economy. If there's money flowing around in the kind of local communities made by the poppy growing, then people, the normal indigenous population, the traders, the kind of shopkeepers, the storekeepers, they make money as well. There's more money in the system, which helps stability, which helps the British Army, in this case in Helmand province, kind of instill this idea of stability. So again, you get a dual approach. Should you get rid of the poppy because it supports the Taliban, but also on the other hand, it actually supports the British Army in its stability operations in the south of the country. What to do with the poppy fields? For the British, they do not want to get rid of the poppy fields, but other organisations, notably the American military, do want to see the spraying of crops. So again, we get this huge difference in approach between the British approach not to get rid of the crops, and for the most part, American agencies saying, yes, get rid of the crops because it's opium, it's heroin, it's bad, and they should be eliminated. There's poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, and you see the big blob in Helmand province, which is the amount of production of opium in that particular region. Now, it's problematic for the British, because 90% of Britain's heroin on the streets of Britain comes from this one province, Helmand province. And so a lot of crime in Britain is actually driven by what's happening in Helmand province, heroin. And also the British military and the British government are responsible across Afghanistan for kind of getting rid of poppy cultivation, to replace poppy cultivation with other crops like wheat or maize or whatever it happens to be. But for the British Army, they're doing absolutely nothing to deal with the poppy cultivation in Helmand province, even though it's a huge problem back home in Britain as well. It's a kind of very ironic situation that the British find themselves in. We get increased Taliban operations. You see British casualty figures going up in the latter part of 2008, and they've gone up even more since October 2008. Roughly one British soldier is killed in Helmand province every 4 days, which is just about acceptable to the British public, but if it gets any more, then it could be problematic. Taliban in 2008, the last year, increased their presence in Afghan provinces from 54% of provinces to now 72% of provinces. Taliban tactics have changed, whereas previously the Taliban used more head-on conflicts with groups of NATO forces. They are now more involved in placing IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which are proving quite successful against NATO forces.
Not another 2-3 minutes?
Yep. Taliban attacks are now moved on to NATO logistics, the kind of soft underbelly of NATO supply lines, including, as we know, in Pakistan, in Peshawar, 300 trucks were burned by a kind of Taliban attack. And there's been more military action. Because of the increased Taliban activities, there's been more NATO forces involved, more NATO action, and this has led to more civilian casualties last year. More civilians died in Afghanistan through NATO attacks last year than in any previous year in the Afghan conflict. The changes now, Admiral Mike Mullen and the new Chief of Staff of the Armed Services in the United States has called for a change of tactics and saying we cannot continue with the search and destroy missions. We have to adopt a more comprehensive approach, using more aid and kind of using it, as we say, a bit more heart and mind, which the US military has come to appreciate over the last few years, especially with this new COIN doctrine that it's written that came out a year or so ago. New troops measure designed to increase the number of available US troops, which means you can change the strategy from search and destroy to clear, hold, build. Basically, US forces clear an area of Taliban. They then have the capacity to hold it because they have the increased troop numbers to hold the particular area and then carry on building. Because you can provide security with an extra number of troops, you then can actually have an idea of building under a kind of secure environment provided by the extra troops. The US military has a new joint Marine Corps Army Counter-Insurgency doctrine, which the British are quite jealous of because the British haven't got round to writing a new COIN doctrine. The British Army has been quite impressed by the US military in terms of its ability to change its operational thinking, especially its strategy in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and write this new doctrine, which the British are trying very hard to copy and produce their own. Is there a strategy? There doesn't seem to be one in Afghanistan. Neither for the British or the Americans does there seem to be a strategy that is firm and decisive and which everybody can follow. I say NATO forces there, NATO as an organisation does not have a joint operational strategy and a joint doctrine to deal with the situation. There's too many things. There seems to be no plan, no strategy, no real kind of idea for the future. Okay, thank you.